She didn't knock to be polite. She knocked because it was life or death. The man inside hadn't spoken to another living soul in nearly 10 years. He preferred the silence of the snow and the company of wolves to the noise of mankind. But when he heard the faint cry of a child, a sound carried on a wind that promised to kill, the lonely mountain man did something he swore he'd never do again. He opened the door. The sound came like a ghost, a soft tapping that the wind almost stole before it reached his ears. Garrett Boone didn't move at first. He sat by his fire, the warmth of familiar friend, his calloused hand resting on the hunting knife he'd been sharpening. The steel felt cold and final in his grip. He'd built this cabin with his own two hands, log by log, nail by nail. He'd built it to keep the world out. Another knock. This one was a little stronger, a little more desperate. It was followed by a third, so faint it was almost a memory. The sound of someone using their last ounce of strength just to be heard. He stood up, his joints creaking like old floorboards. A man didn't survive this long alone in the high peaks without a healthy dose of suspicion. Strangers didn't come this far up the mountain unless they were lost, or they were trouble. Usually they were both. But there was something in the rhythm of that knock. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. And up here, after the first heavy snow of the season, a plea like that was often a person's last word. When he pulled back the heavy wooden bar and opened the door, the wind didn't howl. It whimpered. And standing on his porch, framed by the swirling snow, was a woman. She was soaked to the bone, her thin shawl crusted with ice. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. But behind her, huddled in the folds of her skirt, were two children. A boy, maybe 10 years old, with eyes that looked far too old for his face, and a little girl, no older than 6, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The boy had his thin arms wrapped around his sister, trying to shield her from a storm that had already won. The woman didn't speak. Her lips were cracked and blue. Her eyes held a story of exhaustion and shame, but beneath it all, there was a tiny flickering flame. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the last ember of a fire about to go out for good. Garrett looked from the woman to the boy, then to the little girl. The fire behind him crackled, as if it too was holding its breath. His voice, when he finally used it, was rough and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It had been a long time since he'd had a reason to speak. "You lost." The woman opened her mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. She shook her head, then nodded. It was a yes and a no all at once. It was everything. Garrett looked past her, into the unforgiving white of the storm. He saw their tracks already being erased by the falling snow. They were faint, stumbling. They hadn't come from the main trail. They'd come from the deep woods, the part of the mountain no one dared to cross in winter. And that's when he noticed it. A small, dark stain in the snow a few feet from where she stood. He squinted, his eyes sharp from years of tracking game. It was blood. Not a lot, but it was fresh. Without another word, he stepped aside. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The moment she crossed the threshold into the warmth of the cabin, her knees buckled. Garrett caught her by the elbow, his grip like iron, keeping her from collapsing onto the floor. The boy, ever the protector, guided his sister inside, his wide eyes darting around the small one-room cabin, taking in the stacked firewood, the rifles on the wall, and the man who was bigger and rougher than anyone he'd ever seen. Garrett shut the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing like a final judgment. The storm was locked out. But what had he just locked in? He moved with a quiet efficiency, tossing 2 thick bear pelts toward the hearth. The children collapsed into them without a sound, sinking into the fur like they'd found the promised land. The woman, however, remained on her knees, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was too weak to stand, but too proud to ask for more help. Garrett grabbed the chair from his small table and lifted her into it. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of sticks and wet wool. He stoked the fire until it roared back to life, then poured steaming water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold it. The boy watched Garrett's every move, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight, even though he knew he had no chance. The little girl had already curled into a tight ball in the furs, her body finally surrendering to the warmth and exhaustion. After a long silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the wind outside, Garrett spoke again. "What's your name?" The woman took a sip of the hot water, a pained look on her face as it soothed her raw throat. "Martha," she whispered. "Martha Lindley." He nodded. "The kids?" "Thomas," she said, her gaze shifting to the boy who was still staring at Garrett with suspicion. "And Sarah." Garrett looked at Thomas. "How old are you, boy?" 10, Thomas answered immediately, his voice surprisingly strong. Then he added, glancing at his sister. "She's 6. Garrett crouched by the fire, poking at the logs with an iron rod. He didn't ask about the blood outside. He didn't ask where their father was. He didn't ask why they were walking through the most dangerous pass on the mountain in the middle of a blizzard. Questions could wait. Their faces were pale, their lips were blue, and their clothes were stiff with ice. Survival came first. The truth could come later, if they lived that long. He disappeared into the small back room for a moment and returned with a thick woolen shirt that had belonged to his father, a simple worn dress that had been his mother's, and several pairs of dry, thick socks. He handed them to Martha without a word. Her eyes widened as she looked at the clothes, then back at him. Her lips parted, as if to protest, but he just shook his head. "Get dry first, talk later." She took the clothes with a silent nod. Garrett gave them their privacy, stepping back outside onto the small covered porch. The snow was falling in fine, sharp needles now, and the air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. He stared out at the tree line, a dark, jagged line against the endless white. He'd built this life of solitude on purpose. He'd buried his father on this land. He'd turned his back on the towns and the people in them. He hadn't shared a meal with another person in 5 years, and now a woman and 2 children were drying themselves by his fire. He should have been angry. He should have been scared. He should have been anything other than what he was feeling, which was tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. He was tired of the silence, tired of the ghosts, tired of pretending he liked it this way. When he stepped back inside, the scent of wet wool had been replaced by the smell of rabbit stew, which was simmering in a pot over the fire. The 3 of them were huddled by the hearth. Martha's hair was damp and dark against her pale skin, but some color had returned to her cheeks. Thomas was still awake, his eyes heavy but still watchful, a tiny soldier at his post. Sarah was fast asleep, one small hand curled near her mouth, a soft snoring sound escaping her lips. Garrett sat in his chair across from Martha. It was time for answers. "What happened?" She stared into the flames for a long time before she spoke. "My husband. He passed last spring. A fever took him quick. We tried to make it through the summer in the valley, but the work dried up. No one wants to hire a woman with 2 mouths to feed besides her own." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Winter came early this year. The roof of our cabin gave in 2 nights ago under the weight of the snow. We just walked." "How far?" Garrett asked, his voice low. "Since Monday." Garrett did the math in his head. It was Friday. 5 days. 5 days walking through a blizzard with 2 small children. It was a miracle they were alive. Martha's eyes filled with something that looked a lot like guilt. "I saw the smoke from your chimney. I didn't know what else to do. We were so cold." "You did the right thing," Garrett said, and the words surprised him as much as they did her. She blinked, a single tear tracing a path down her soot-stained cheek. Garrett stood, ladled the thick rabbit stew into 3 empty bowls and handed one to Thomas. The boy's stomach growled so loud it made the fire hiss. "Eat," Garrett said gruffly. Thomas looked at his mother for permission. She gave him a small, tired nod. "Go on." They ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken words. They took small, careful bites, as if they were afraid the food would vanish if they ate too quickly. When they were finished, Martha gathered the bowls and stacked them neatly, a small act of domesticity that seemed strangely out of place in Garrett's rough-hewn world. "I never had a wife," Garrett said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Figured I wouldn't be much good at it. Never met a woman who disagreed." Martha looked at him, her expression unreadable. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow on the wall. "There's a bed in the back room. You and the children take it. I'll sleep in the chair. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, he cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. And you're not arguing. Not after 5 days in the snow. She didn't. She woke the children gently and guided them into the small room, the door clicking shut behind them. Garrett stared into the fire, the silence of the cabin returning. But it felt different now. It was heavier, filled with the breathing of 3 other people. He thought about the knock on his door, how it had shaken something loose inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago. He felt a strange sense of something. It wasn't a burden. It felt like a beginning. But just as his eyes began to grow heavy, a new sound cut through the night. It was soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. Hooves, 2 sets of them, moving slow and steady through the deep snow. Garrett was on his feet in an instant, his exhaustion gone, replaced by a cold, sharp alertness. He moved to the window, peering through a small patch he'd cleared in the frost. The storm had broken, and the moon was a sliver of bone in the dark sky, casting an eerie blue light on the snow-covered landscape. And there, emerging from the blackness of the pine trees, were 2 figures on horseback. Men didn't ride this deep into the mountains at night in this weather unless they were looking for something, or someone. He reached for the rifle leaning against the hearth, his fingers wrapping around the familiar worn wood. He didn't raise it, not yet. Behind him the fire popped, a sudden, sharp sound in the tense silence. And Garrett Boone, the man who had invited the world back into his home, suddenly remembered why he had locked it out in the first place. The sound of the hooves was all wrong. It wasn't the frantic, hurried pace of lost travelers. It was slow, patient, methodical. Each thud of hoof on snow was like a hammer striking an anvil, a sound that spoke of intent. And intent, this far from civilization, usually came with a gun and a bad reason. Garrett pressed his palm against the rough log wall beside the window, steadying himself as he peered out into the moon-drenched clearing. The 2 riders were clearer now. One was tall and lean, slouched in his saddle with an arrogance that fatigue couldn't hide. The other was broader, a heavy-set man who sat on his horse like he owned it, and the mountain it stood on. Their horses were strong and well-fed, a rarity in a winter this harsh. That alone put Garrett on edge. Men who ate well when others were starving were either very lucky or they were the reason others were starving. He heard a faint creak from the back room. Martha. She was awake. She must have heard it too. She was probably lying in the dark, her ears straining, wondering if the world outside meant salvation or ruin. Garrett tightened his grip on the rifle, holding it across his chest like a shield. The riders dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate. They were taking their time, letting the silence stretch, letting the sound of their boots crunching in the snow serve as their announcement. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Garrett had seen it years ago, when greedy men from the railroad company had tried to force his father off this very land. He remembered his father's jaw, set like granite, as he stepped onto the porch with a shotgun cradled in his arms. Garrett had been just a boy, but he'd learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. One of the men finally spoke, his voice smooth and easy, as if he were a neighbor stopping by to borrow a cup of sugar. "Evening. See the smoke from your chimney. Only light between here and the ridge." Garrett didn't answer. He was a shadow inside a dark cabin. Let them wonder. Let them get nervous. Men like this expected fear. They fed on it. Silence starved them. The second man let out a short, ugly chuckle. "Reckon he's deaf, Silas." "He ain't deaf," the first man, Silas, called out, his voice a little louder now. "Smoke don't come from an empty cabin. We're not looking for trouble, friend. Just 2 cold travelers hoping to share a bit of your fire." Garrett finally moved, but not toward the door. He slipped back to the door of the bedroom and cracked it open just an inch. Martha was sitting bolt upright in the bed, her face a pale mask in the gloom. Her children were asleep on either side of her, oblivious. Her eyes met Garrett's, and the question was plain. Who are they? He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head and pressed a finger to his lips. Her arms tightened around her children. She understood. She was used to being silent, used to making herself small. She had learned how to disappear when danger came knocking. Garrett closed the door soundlessly and returned to his position. The men were on his porch now. Silas took off his leather gloves, his movements slow and theatrical. "You really gonna make us stand out here and freeze? That ain't very neighborly." When Garrett finally spoke, his voice was the sound of rocks scraping together. "Don't recall asking for neighbors." The second man laughed again, a harsh, barking sound. "He's got a tongue on him, Silas." He stepped closer to the door, his bulk blocking the moonlight. "Come on now, old man. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Garrett lifted the rifle. He didn't aim it at them, but he raised it just enough so that the moonlight coming through the window caught the long, blue-black steel of the barrel. It was a statement. "Fire's mine," Garrett said, his voice flat. "The mountain's big enough for you to find your own." That seemed to end the charade. Silas's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "We ain't just passing through," he said, his voice dropping low. "We're looking for someone, a woman with 2 brats." Every muscle in Garrett's body went rigid. He thought of Martha's haunted eyes, the way she clutched her children, the blood in the snow. He had assumed she was running from poverty, from starvation. But he was wrong. She was running from them. "Word is," Silas continued, his eyes narrowing, "her cabin collapsed. Figured she might have passed this way. You seen her?" Garrett let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. His heart was a hammer against his ribs, but his face was a mask of indifference. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, the rifle held steady across his chest. "Ain't seen a soul in 5 years," he lied, his voice as cold and dead as the winter landscape. "And I aim to keep it that way." Silas stared at the door, trying to peer into the darkness of the cabin. The second man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "He's lying," he growled. "I can smell him. Smell the fear." Silas raised a hand, silencing him. He forced a smile back onto his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "All right, friend. Have it your way. We won't trouble you no more tonight." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "But we'll be back. Ain't many places to hide in these mountains, especially when you're hiding something that belongs to Mr. Corbin." With that, they turned and walked back to their horses. They mounted up and rode away, their dark shapes swallowed by the forest. Garrett stayed at the window long after they were gone, the rifle still clutched in his hands. He waited until the only sound was the wind, until the silence felt like his own again. Only then did he lower the gun and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned and opened the door to the back room. Martha was still sitting up, her children still asleep beside her. Her eyes searched his face, begging for an answer to the question she was too afraid to ask. "They're gone," Garrett said. "For now." A wave of relief washed over her, so powerful it made her tremble. But then his next words brought the fear crashing back. "They mentioned a name," Garrett said, his voice grim. "Corbin. And they said you were hiding something that belongs to him." Martha flinched as if he'd struck her. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, Sarah, and her expression turned to one of pure terror. Garrett's blood ran cold. They hadn't been talking about property. They were talking about the child. Garrett didn't sleep. He sat in his rocking chair, the rifle across his lap, and stared into the dying embers of the fire. The name Corbin echoed in the quiet cabin. It wasn't the name of a simple landowner. It was a name that carried weight, a name whispered in the valleys with a mixture of fear and resentment. Jedediah Corbin was a man who bought up land, bought up debts, and bought up people. He was a cancer spreading through the high country, and somehow Martha and her children had ended up in his crosshairs. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the shutters, Garrett stood, his body stiff from the long vigil. He found Martha in the main room, already awake. She was staring out the frosted window, her arms wrapped around herself. The children were still asleep. "He won't stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He never stops." Garrett poured 2 cups of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small space. He handed one to her. "Tell me everything," he said. It wasn't a request, she told him. The story came out in a torrent, a dam of secrets bursting open. Her husband, Daniel, hadn't just been a simple farmer. He'd been in Corbin's employ, a kind of groundskeeper for one of his remote properties. But Daniel had a weakness for gambling, and soon he was deep in debt to the one man you never wanted to owe. Corbin didn't want money. He owned Daniel. Then 6 years ago, Martha said, her voice trembling, a woman showed up at our door. She was sick, dying, and she had a baby with her, a little girl. Chordu, she choked back a sob. It was Corbin's child. He'd cast the mother out, but he didn't want the shame of an illegitimate daughter. He forced Daniel to take the child, to raise her as our own, in secret. It was a way to pay off the debt. Garrett stared at her, the pieces clicking into place, the fear in her eyes, the desperation. Sarah, he said. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face now. She's not my daughter, not by blood, but I love her as if she were. When Daniel died, I thought we were free, but Corbin sent his men. He said the debt wasn't settled. He said Sarah was his property, and he was coming to collect her. The cold fury that settled in Garrett's chest was an old familiar feeling. It was the same rage he'd felt in the war, the kind that made the world go quiet and clear. He looked at the door to the back room, where an innocent 6-year-old girl was sleeping. Why does he want her now? Garrett asked. I don't know, Martha whispered, but the way his men looked at her, it wasn't right. It was like they were looking at a prize pig, not a child. Garrett stood up and walked to the wall where his tools hung. He took down a heavy axe and ran his thumb over the sharpened edge. Then we'll make sure he never gets her. The words hung in the air, a solemn vow. For the first time since she'd arrived, a flicker of genuine hope appeared in Martha's eyes. She wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were a blur of preparation. The cabin, once a simple shelter, became a fortress. Garrett taught Thomas how to reinforce the shutters, how to pack the gaps in the log walls with mud and moss to stop a stray bullet. He took the boy out into the woods, not with a toy gun, but with a real rifle. He showed him how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger, how to hit a target 50 yards away. The boy was a natural, his hands steady, his eyes focused. He had a fire in him that reminded Garrett of himself at that age. Inside, Martha was a whirlwind of activity. She organized their meager food supplies, stitched thicker linings into their coats, and created a sense of order in the chaos. She brought a warmth and a life to the cabin that Garrett hadn't realized was missing. And Sarah, sweet, quiet Sarah, seemed to blossom in the safety of their small sanctuary. She would follow Garrett around as he worked, her small hand sometimes finding its way into his large, calloused one. He found himself carving small animals for her out of scraps of wood, a bear, a fox, an eagle. She would line them up on the mantelpiece like a row of tiny guardians. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a fragile peace settled over them. Thomas was showing Sarah how the wooden eagle could fly, and Martha was humming a soft lullaby. Garrett watched them, a strange feeling tightening his chest. This felt right. It felt like home. Why do you live all the way up here, Garrett? Thomas asked suddenly, his childish curiosity cutting through the quiet moment. Garrett looked into the fire. Because the world down there, it takes things from you. Martha met his gaze across the room, her eyes full of a sad understanding. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, she found him on the porch staring up at the star-filled sky. He's coming soon, she said softly. Garrett nodded. I know. Are you scared? He thought for a moment. I used to be. Scared of dying. Scared of being alone. But now. He looked at her, the moonlight catching the silver in his beard. Now, I'm just scared of losing this. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him. Before either of them could say another word, the sound they had been dreading shattered the night. The dogs tied up near the woods began to bark, a frantic, ferocious sound. Garrett was moving before the second bark echoed through the valley. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the door and peered out the window. It wasn't two men this time. It was a sea of dancing lights in the trees, lanterns, at least 6 of them, swinging like malevolent eyes in the darkness. They were fanning out, forming a semicircle around the cabin. They were coming to end this. Get the children, Garrett said, his voice deadly calm. Down to the cellar, now. Martha didn't hesitate. She scooped up a sleeping Sarah, and Thomas, already awake and pale-faced, followed her. Garrett pulled back the bearskin rug, lifted the heavy trapdoor, and watched them descend into the darkness of the root cellar. "Garrett," Martha whispered from the shadows below, her voice tight with fear. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice a low growl. "You just keep them quiet." He closed the door, slid the rug back into place, and turned to face the front of the cabin. He doused the main lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the fire's embers. He moved to the window, a ghost in his own home, the long rifle feeling like an extension of his arm. A voice boomed from the darkness outside. It was Silas. "Garrett Boone, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding. Mr. Corbin is a reasonable man. Just send out the girl, and we'll be on our way. No one else needs to get hurt." Garrett raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. He lined up the sight on the lead lantern. "Last chance, old man." Garrett's answer was a deafening roar of gunfire that split the night. The bullet found its mark, shattering the lantern and plunging Silas's side of the clearing into darkness. A man screamed. Horses panicked. Chaos erupted. They had come expecting to intimidate a lonely old hermit. They had no idea they had just declared war on a grizzly bear protecting his cubs. The night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the thin walls of the cabin, splintering wood, shattering the last of the window panes. Garrett didn't wait for them to regroup. He was a phantom, moving from one window to the next, firing with a deadly efficiency honed by years of hunting and a war he tried every day to forget. He wasn't just shooting at them, he was hurting them, using the terrain, making them think he was more than one man. He heard a man cry out in pain from the east side of the cabin. Another cursed from the west as a bullet grazed his cover. They were disorganized, spooked. They had underestimated him. But they were numerous, and they were getting angry. Suddenly, the front door shuddered, the wood groaning under the impact of a heavy boot. Then another. They were going to try to breach it. Garrett flattened himself against the wall beside the door, his hunting knife now in his hand. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and pine. The door burst open, and a large figure silhouetted by the moonlight lunged inside. Garrett moved like a viper. He drove the knife up under the man's ribs, a swift, silent, and brutal motion. The man gasped, a look of pure shock on his face, before collapsing in a heap on the floor. Garrett kicked the door shut and slid the heavy bar back into place just as another volley of bullets slammed into it. He was bleeding. A piece of shrapnel from the door had sliced his arm, a hot, searing pain. He ignored it. He crawled to the hearth, his rifle empty. He grabbed one of the 2 revolvers he'd loaded and left on the mantelpiece. 6 shots left. The shooting from outside stopped. An eerie silence fell over the clearing. "Boone!" a new voice called out. It was deeper, older, and carried an authority the others lacked. "My name is Malcolm Carney. I served with your father." Garrett froze. He crept to the broken window and peered out. An older man with a gray beard had stepped into the moonlight, his hands raised to show they were empty. "I didn't know this was Boone land until I heard your name," Malcolm said. "My quarrel is with Corbin's property, not with the son of a man I respected." "She's not property?" Garrett growled back. "That ain't for me to decide," Malcolm said grimly. "But I didn't sign up to get my men killed over it. Not like this. We're leaving. But know this. Corbin will not let this go. He'll send others. Men who don't know your father's name. Men who won't stop until they burn this cabin to the ground with you and everyone inside it." Garrett watched as Malcolm gathered his men, the ones who could still walk, and they disappeared back into the forest. The immediate danger was over, but the war had just begun. He stumbled back from the window, his wounded arm screaming in protest. He slid down the wall, the revolver clattering to the floor. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, shaking exhaustion. He had won the battle, but Malcolm's words echoed in his mind. They won't stop. He pushed himself to his feet, walked to the center of the room, and lifted the trap door. 3 pale faces looked up at him from the darkness. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now." Martha scrambled up the ladder, her eyes taking in the scene of destruction, the broken door, the shattered windows, the dark shape on the floor. Her gaze fell on Garrett's bloody arm and she gasped. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said, but the room was starting to spin. Thomas and Sarah climbed out of the cellar, their eyes wide with fear. Sarah ran to Garrett and clung to his leg, her small body trembling. "You saved us," she whispered. He looked down at the little girl, then at Martha, who was already tearing a strip of cloth from her dress to bandage his arm. He looked at Thomas, who was standing tall, trying to be brave. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage covered in blood and sweat, Garrett Boone knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would die before he let anyone harm them. The days that followed the attack were a strange mix of peace and foreboding. They patched the cabin as best they could, boarding up the windows and reinforcing the door. The body of the man Garrett had killed was buried in an unmarked grave deep in the woods, a grim reminder of how close they had come to death. The incident had changed them. The lines of stranger and host had been erased, forged into something stronger in the heat of battle. They were a unit now, a family. Garrett's arm was a painful, throbbing mess, but Martha tended to it with a gentle skill that surprised him. She cleaned it, stitched it with a fishing hook and thread, and wrapped it in poultices made from herbs she found in the forest. During those quiet moments, as she cared for him, they started to talk. Really talk. He told her about the war, about the friends he'd lost, about the hollowness that had driven him up the mountain. She told him about her dreams of having a small farm, of a life where her children didn't have to be afraid. They were two broken souls finding solace in each other's company. But the shadow of Corbin loomed over them. They knew Malcolm's warning was not an idle threat. So they prepared. Garrett took Thomas deeper into the mountains, showing him secret paths, hidden caves, and sources of fresh water. "If they come back in force," Garrett told him, "you take your mother and sister and you run. You don't stop until you reach the river. You understand?" Thomas nodded, his young face grim. "But what about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Garrett lied. One morning, Garrett was checking his trap lines on the far ridge when he saw it, a thick column of black smoke rising into the clear blue sky. It was miles away in the direction of the next valley, but it was too much smoke for a campfire. It was the smoke of a burning building. He raced back to the cabin, his heart pounding with a new kind of fear. This was different. This wasn't a small band of thugs. This was something bigger. "They're burning people out," he told Martha, his face pale. "They're clearing the mountain." Corbin wasn't just coming for Sarah anymore. He was coming for the whole mountain, and he was using a scorched earth policy to get it. They couldn't hide. They couldn't fight an army. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping dread. "We have to leave," Martha said, her voice shaking. "We can run. Go west." "There's nowhere to run where a man like Corbin can't reach," Garrett said, his mind racing. There had to be another way. And then an old memory surfaced, a name he hadn't thought of in 20 years. "Jacob Monroe," he said aloud. "Who?" "An old friend. We served together in the war. He became a circuit judge. A real one. Not one of Corbin's paid-off cronies. He's a man of the law. A good man. If anyone can help us, it's him." The only problem was, Jacob lived 2 days' ride away, on the other side of the mountain range. Garrett would have to leave them alone. Vulnerable. "I have to go," Garrett said, the decision solidifying in his mind. "It's our only chance." Martha's face was a mask of fear, but she nodded. "Be careful," she whispered. The goodbye was short and fraught with unspoken emotions. He knelt before Sarah and handed her the small wooden eagle he had carved. "You keep him safe for me," he said. She threw her arms around his neck. Thomas shook his hand, a solemn man-to-man gesture. And Martha, she simply placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Come back," was all she said. Garrett rode like a man possessed, pushing his horse to its limits. He rode through the day and into the night, guided by the stars. He knew he was being watched. He could feel eyes on him from the trees. Corbin's scouts were everywhere. On the second day, he was ambushed. 2 of Corbin's men came out of nowhere, guns blazing. Garrett's horse went down, and he was thrown into a ravine. He managed to shoot one of the men, but the other had him cornered. It was a brutal, desperate fight, but Garrett's mountain-hardened toughness won out. He emerged battered, bruised, and without a horse, but alive. He walked the rest of the way, arriving at Judge Monroe's homestead late at night, looking like a ghost. Jacob, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, took one look at his old friend and knew something was terribly wrong. Garrett told him everything. As Jacob listened, his face grew darker and darker. "Jedediah Corbin," he said, the name like a curse on his lips. "I've been building a case against that monster for years. Land fraud, intimidation, murder. But I've never been able to make anything stick. He's always one step ahead." "He's going to kill them, Jacob," Garrett said, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "Not if I can help it," the judge said, his jaw set. He stood up and began pacing. "I can issue a warrant for his arrest based on your testimony. I can deputize a federal marshal. But it will take me 3 days to get the papers and the manpower." 3 days. Garrett's heart sank. "They don't have 3 days. "You have to give them to me, Garrett," Jacob said, his eyes locking with his friend's. "Go back, hold them off, barricade the cabin. Do whatever you have to do. Just buy me 3 days." The journey back was a living nightmare. Without a horse, Garrett had to travel on foot, his body screaming in protest. He moved through the wilderness like an animal, living off the land, his every sense on high alert. He was driven by a single terrifying thought: "I'm too late." When he finally stumbled over the last ridge and saw his cabin, his blood ran cold. There were horses tied up outside, 4 of them, and the door was wide open. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He ran. He burst into the cabin, his last revolver in his hand, ready for a fight. But the scene that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. 4 men were in the cabin, but they weren't Corbin's thugs. They were simple homesteaders, farmers from the valley. They were standing around his table, looking at Martha with fear and desperation in their eyes. "They burned us out," one of the men said, his voice cracking. "Corbin's men. They came at dawn, gave us 5 minutes to get out before they lit the torch. We lost everything." Another man pointed a shaky finger at Martha. "We heard. We heard that you stood up to them, that you fought them off. We came to ask for your help." Martha, who had been a terrified refugee only weeks ago, stood before them, calm and composed. She had become the leader they needed, but their hope was short-lived. A new group of riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. This time, it was Corbin himself, flanked by a dozen of his most ruthless men. He sat on a magnificent black stallion, a cruel smile on his face. "Well, well," Corbin sneered, his eyes falling on Sarah, who was hiding behind Martha's legs. "Look what we have here. A little reunion. I've come for what's mine." "She's not yours," Garrett snarled, stepping forward to stand beside Martha, his empty revolver feeling uselessly light in his hand. Corbin laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Oh, she's more mine than you can possibly imagine. You see, my father had a peculiar will. He left his entire fortune to me, but with one condition. I had to produce a living heir. And my dear Sarah here," he said, his eyes gleaming with a sick possessiveness, "is my ticket to that fortune." It all made sense now. The desperation, the cruelty. It was never about a debt. It was about greed. "You'll have to kill me first," Garrett said, raising the empty gun. "That can be arranged," Corbin said, raising his own pistol. But before he could fire, a new voice echoed through the clearing, sharp and clear as a bell. "Jedediah Corbin, by the authority of the United States government, you are under arrest." Judge Jacob Monroe rode into the clearing, flanked by 2 armed federal marshals. He had made it. He was a day early. Corbin's face turned white with rage and disbelief. His men looked at each other, confused. The standoff was a tense, silent tableau. And then Corbin did something unexpected. He laughed. A wild, maniacal laugh. "You think you've won?" he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He spurred his horse forward, straight towards Sarah, his hand outstretched to grab her. What happened next was a blur. Garrett lunged forward, pushing Sarah out of the way. Martha raised the rifle she'd been hiding behind her back. The other homesteaders, seeing their chance, charged Corbin's men, and Judge Monroe fired his pistol into the air. It was over in seconds. Corbin was dragged from his horse, screaming threats and curses. His men, seeing the federal marshals, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Justice, it turned out, had finally come to the mountain. In the aftermath, as Corbin and his men were led away in chains, Judge Monroe walked over to Garrett and Martha. He was holding a stack of old yellowed papers. "I did some digging into the county records," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Corbin's claim on this land was fraudulent. It turns out," he said, handing the papers to Garrett, "that the entire mountain was deeded to your father by the government for his service in the war. He never filed the paperwork correctly, so it just sat there, forgotten." He clapped Garrett on the shoulder. "This land, this whole mountain, it's all yours, son. It always was." Garrett stared at the papers, at the official seal, at his father's name. He looked at Martha, at Thomas, at Sarah. He looked at the other families who had lost their homes, who were now looking to him. He wasn't just a lonely hermit anymore. He was a protector, a provider, a leader. They didn't just rebuild the cabin, they built a community. The families Corbin had displaced found a new home on Boone Mountain. They built new cabins, a communal barn, and planted new fields. They called their settlement Lindley's Hollow in honor of the woman whose quiet courage had started it all. Garrett and Martha were married by Judge Monroe the following spring on the porch of the cabin where she had first knocked. Their family grew, not just with the arrival of their own child, a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's smile, but with all the lost souls who found a safe harbor in their hollow. One summer evening, years later, Garrett sat on that same porch, watching the sun set over the peaks. The air was filled with the sounds of children laughing and the low murmur of conversation from the other cabins. Martha sat beside him, her hand in his. Sarah, now a young woman, was teaching Thomas's children how to carve a wooden eagle. He remembered the silence. He remembered the cold. He remembered the man who had opened the door that snowy night, a man who thought he wanted to be left alone. He had been so wrong. He hadn't needed solitude. He had needed a reason to live, and she had knocked on his door and given him one. The lonely mountain man was lonely no more. He was home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Until next time, stay safe out there.